All right, I would like to ask our next speaker. Let me first introduce him, Edwin Bendyk, journalist for many years working for Politica Weekly. He's been describing many revolutionary ideas in many journals and media outlets. He is also an academic teacher, teaching in the Collegium Civitas, when he leads the Center for Future Research, and he also works within the Polish Academy of Science. He was part of the Nowoczesna Polska movement and the Green Poland initiative in 2020. He was elected as the chairperson for the Stefan Batory Foundation in Warsaw. Stefan Bendyk. Edwin Bendyk. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present at such an interesting conference. I'm sorry that I couldn't join you earlier yesterday, but even the module and discussions before lunch today have clearly demonstrated the importance of these topics, and I think what you have said before will resonate with what I'm going to say. I think Jana set the standard very high. I'm going to approach this topic from a more empirical perspective, offering some reflexive generalization as well, perhaps. I hope that also the following presentations will provide the opportunities to trace these connections. I would like to start with the local level, and in a way try to capture the phenomenon of locality in the 19th century in Karl Marx theories and his thoughts, when together with Engels they wrote in 1848, they wrote about the specificity of rural life, and then following further studies, contacts with rural structures, along with the experience of Obszczyna, the community life, Marx revised his thoughts, his theory, and rejected the model of universal path towards emancipation and change. We were discussing systemic change. He, even then, knew that there was no single path. What he wrote was perhaps true for the West, but it might not be true for other cultural areas. And in this way, he opened up the space for pluriversalism instead of universalism. This is something that resonates very strongly right now, especially in African philosophers and Latin American philosophers' theories, which display not only resistance towards Western philosophy, which is trying to explain others' experiences, but also the resistance towards digital universalism. The decolonization of technology movement is based on the fact that this philosophy as embodied in Facebook is actually an extension of the Enlightenment ideas, just like communism was actually an extension of such a universalistic idea. So the idea is to provide the opportunity for pluriversal approach by using local resources. I'm not going to use examples from Latin America or Africa, because I was inspired by Ignacy Karpowicz, a famous Polish writer. He was awarded an award by Our Weekly a few years ago, and when he was during the awarding ceremony. He shared a thought based on his experience, a long-term experience of living in Africa. He then decided to go back and live once again in a village in Poland, near Białystok, and he told us that there's actually no difference between living in an African village and a Polish village, and it's inspiring in the same kind of way. Today, for those who are looking for the sources for social reconstruction, the category of Ubuntu, which seems to be important for many African communities, and African metaphysics, which actually enable a completely different relationship between a human and technology than Aristotelian or European thinking do, opening up new spaces. And enabling us to actually overcome the limitations that we discussed at the previous session. So I'm not going to go beyond Poland. I would like to invite you to join me on a journey to 3 locations, 3 villages. I'll start with the place that is closest to my heart. I come from Olsztyn, the main city in Warmia and Mazurem. Before that, it used to be the East Prussia, and then Warmia again. It's deeply marked with history. The whole land is said to be under the curse of perpetual return. As soon as people were leaving, they had to go back. And then they were forced to leave again. Because the inhabitants of Warmia were mostly Catholic, they were not as persecuted as the evangelical inhabitants of Mazure. So up until 1970, most of them stayed. So only after 1975, there was a process of joining families. Many people then left for Germany. The villages in Warmia became empty, and they were settled by people from the rest of Poland, mostly very interesting people who decided to go into this, something that we called inner immigration, trying to escape the communist regime. So there is a village called Węgajty, which was settled by people who were active in the Grotowski Theatre. It's an icon, of a world-renowned icon of theatre. So people who left Grotowski and but they were brought up in this canon of art. They decided that they were looking for a new way of life, and they actually made use of an empty space in this village, creating Teatr Węgajty Theatre in an empty shed in that village. Perhaps you haven't heard about it, but it's one of the most extraordinary institutions of free alternative theatre. It has never become an institution. It's still an association which has been poor for the last 30 years, but which is still active, and Wacław and Mute Sabaszko, they have been organizing regularly a festival called Theatre Village. This is an Umphalus Mundi, the navel of the world, where suddenly in an empty space marked with the metaphysics of history, you see the concentration of energy from the whole world. You get to see people and troops coming from all over the world, now even from Belarus, refugee-based theaters. They come there to talk about the most important things, using art, using debate. Very frequently they are the avant-garde. They go beyond what the mainstream media are talking about. I remember in 2015 the whole program of the Theatre Village was focusing on the otherness, other as the refugee, other as person with disabilities, other as somebody with different sexual orientation or gender. And even though the program was prepared 6 months before, suddenly we had this festival happening when at the very moment when the refugee crisis was exploding. So they were ready. They have already prepared to talk about it. Very interesting space, the place where people generate reflection, and perhaps create a utopia, micro-utopia or heterotopia. Because this place does not refer in any way to the history of that place. It does not make attempts to artificially connect to the former inhabitants of that land. It doesn't seem to be important. They actually they use the empty space, the space left by, as the source of energy. That's the first story. Let's talk about the second story. In a faraway corner of Poland, Bielsko-Biała, and the village of Wietnanowice. The village which is famous for the fact that there are still 30 people talking the Wymieszorisch language. It's the Old Dutch or Old High German language. Scholars are disputing the origin. This is the language that is still there following the settlement back in history, and the theory says that you need many speakers to keep the language alive, but actually you have just 30 speakers, and you have a language that is very much alive, used in literary creation, literary work. They have been translating Tolkien's work into that language. So just imagine, how is that possible? They were lucky to be able to generate very interesting elites out of this very small community. Tymoteusz Król was the latest regenerator of that language. He decided, even when he was a high school student, he decided to create a grammar for the language and to keep the language in this systematic way. He is a genius. He's been funded by the Polish government out of the funds for these very talented children. So he created the grammar of the Wymieszorisch language. So, and then Lech Majewski made a movie, The Mill and the Cross, which was also part of the Sundance Festival, where he received a mention. The movie is based on one of the Bruegel's painting, and what is important is that the actors speak Wymieszorisch language, which is the closest to the Dutch as it was used in Bruegel's time, and Tymoteusz Król was consulting on that movie. The third story that I'm going to tell you about is the least artistic, perhaps, the most ordinary. The location is the village of Broniów, close to Szydłowiec, in the center of Poland, the area which is one of those which have been most affected by the negative effects of transformation, with 30-40% of the unemployment rate. All the industry that was active there went bankrupt. It was mostly military production plants. So people who were either working in these industries or working the land, they actually were left with nothing. Only after we joined the EU, there were some opportunities opening up for them through subsidies from the farming subsidies from EU, or the opportunities to go abroad and work there. So you could actually think that there might not be much going on during in such a place, and the most popular narrative about places like this is the pornography of poverty, showing people drinking cheap wine and other pathological situations. So what we needed a very good ethnographer, very sensitive ethnographer, to show that it's actually something else. We also, I'm going to tell you about this ethnographer. Everybody who's socially sensitive and culturally sensitive looks at the signs. When you go into the village, something that draws attention was that right after the signpost, you could see that the grass has been cut. So that meant that somebody was actually taking care of the place. And then when you looked at specific elements of social life, and people were very, very poor there, and elements such as the voluntary fire service that is in every Polish village, when you looked at the vehicles they had, how prepared they were, and they were the objects of art, the expression of pride, of identity. And Tomasz Rakowski, who was actually the ethnographer there, he spent many months studying that place, and he showed that there was something very extraordinary there. So that people there survived as a community which was able to reflect on themselves. And of course, they wouldn't be able to describe themselves with the language that Joanna used, but they were actually able to reflect on their own position by different practices, including artistic practices. So, what are the resources in such places? Tomasz Rakowski showed us. I'm almost finished. So, they were making an amazing kind of synthesis. Because they had experience in working in big industrial plants during the communist times, they actually had an experience of modernity based on some standardization on material, certain kind of material culture, and the kinds of ways of working with material reality that is only provided by industry. But because it was in a village and there were village inhabitants, they were also pre-modern, so they never got in touch with modernity in the conscious kind of way. So they learned about the standards, but in practice, in daily practice, they were actually resisting standards. So they keep rejecting, for example, what the market is offering them. The lawn mower that you can buy, anything that they buy that is needed in the household, they often rebuild it to adjust and tweak it to their own needs, and they're actually most willing to do things themselves. For example, to create the lawnmower using an old push, the pram, and an old engine, or they can reuse materials, quite amazing materials. And you can see that this is a kind of competence when we use the modern dictionary of the urban hipsters, that this is actually a maker's culture being developed there, with a lot of hackers' ethics, which rejects the standards. So we actually have a myth, or that the urban culture is talking about, and is lived there, a myth that we could see in the Bridge Plaza. Yes, there is this repair cafe. Tomasz Rakowski enabled these inhabitants to actually show it. And here's where I start the combination exercise. The localities let me introduce another element of technology. We critiqued it and we criticized it, and we were right, but actually in the digital world there was something very important happening. Regardless of what it's doing with us, regardless of how much are we able to control what it is doing with us, the digital transformation reshaped the social reality, introducing hybrid space, multidimensional space, where social space is no longer connected to geographical, to physical space. The connections, Tomasz Rakowski, what he did was to connect very quickly people from Broniów village with real hackers. And it turned out that at the level of materiality, not the reflection, but the materiality, that these people speak the same language and they have this common resource that can be used to create stuff, to look for remedies, to look for answers and solutions that we were talking about. So these are these dispersed local initiatives. Joanna was asking about the future. We see how fragile and vulnerable such local initiatives might be vis-a-vis the big politics and the soulless forces. But that's actually not true when we look at our eastern border. Yes, that's true. This is a senseless, brutal state machine. But we also have very social reactions in, for example, the Michałów municipality, when women organize themselves and they're actually resisting the state apparatus. They draw energy from the fact that they are local there. This locality and the feeling of being grounded in this local community, in this particular place, gives them the strength to do things. All these initiatives have a chance. Of course, this is not a recipe, 100% guarantee for success, but it is an inherent element of a mix that can generate the solutions, ideas. Only the mix, only the diverse, such a diverse mixture can provide answers. Marx already knew that there is no universal answer. The Bolsheviks and communists were not willing to hear him on this, but we do know that we need the multiplicity, many things that can then combine into a kind of republic, and out of this, the sum total of these individual sources, it will only then be able to create a project, draft of social transformation. Can we manage that? Well, I don't know. We're looking for an answer. We do have in our history, Polish history, one experience when we see that we cannot foresee stuff, but they are real. In 1979, Polish sociologists claimed that Polish society is being tormented by something that they called the sociological vacuum, that we are organized around the family, or we think in terms of a nation, and we are unable to build structures that are in between. We just don't see it. It's our blind spot. And a year later, solidarity emerged, the biggest social innovation. And here I would quote from Alain Touraine, the French sociologist. It was a synthesis, a combination of many local streams which generated a very transformative phenomenon. Can it happen now based on this new social reality, social space? Perhaps. This is a question that I would like to ask. I feel intuitively that the answer is yes, but I'm very interested just to hear your thoughts about this and perhaps some critique of this, what I said. Thank you.
Dziękuję Ci.
Thank you, Edwin. Edwin Bendyk was our speaker. So many thoughts in my head when I hear your stories. As for the history, for example, if history of Swordford is future. And Zugfurt is the first city which develops from the past into future. How about this proposition? Secondly, as for being local or regional, we have a great example that here nearly all of us are refugees and migrants. By moving the boundaries, Polish boundaries, that was one of the largest human migrations of the times. So here have settlers who haven't been rooted here for several generations. Andrzej Stasik, for example, in his Galician stories, described stories by Lemkas, who were able in Mechnice to settle there and try to write their own grammar, to create their own culture or support their own culture. There are several thoughts in my head, but I don't want to make it longer with my comments. I think that Monika will bring it even closer to us later on.